Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. I'm Simon from Scar Illustration, and I hope you're keeping well. Today I'm going to talk about how to render like a pro. Let's dive in. Forget about speed and focus on accuracy and brush efficiency. There's no point in scribbling away at light speed if you have to repaint something 4 to 5 times to get what you want. Plus, nobody will really care how long it took to complete. All they're going to be interested in is how the final painting looks. With that in mind, try being more intentional with your art. And think about every brush stroke. Remember, rendering is just the act of adding the final touches to a piece. Because rendering by itself, out of context, doesn't really mean anything. First, make sure that your composition, or where everything is positioned, is good. The best way to do that, in my experience, is thumbnails, and lots of them. I made a video on how to create thumbnails, and I'll leave it in the description below. Next, work out your values, your blacks, whites, and grays. An easy way to check those is to add a layer on top of all your other layers. Fill it with black, and change the blend mode to color. You'll then be able to easily see how all your values work together. Then look at your focal point, or points, or what you want the viewer to spend more time looking at. After that, work out your lighting or where your lights are coming from. I generally use 2 to 3 light sources max. Otherwise, it starts getting a bit too cluttered and difficult to work out where all the shadows and highlights will be. And finally, think about your colors. For this, I tend to do a few color sketches so I know how everything will look in the end at a basic level. Once those are all working, then it's time to get going on the final painting. If you decide to skip the preceding steps, you'll find yourself having to go back and forth a lot. And at some point, you'll have to make all those decisions anyway. So in my opinion, it's better to make those decisions before starting the painting, as this will be a lot less frustrating and time-consuming in the end. So now you're ready to start rendering. But before you get going, you're going to have to work out all the different textures in your painting, because light interacts differently with different materials. If you were to paint everything the same, then it would be far more difficult for the viewer to work out exactly what they are. Sometimes, if the object's shape is easily recognizable, then it will be easier. But if not, then how you understand and are able to convey textures will be crucial to the believability of your painting. To gain an understanding of how to render things such as water, fire, metal, or leather, you will need to keenly observe those materials and how they are all affected by light. And by that, I mean really spend time looking at objects in real life, in photos, or a bit of both. If there are some materials that you've not painted before, you might want to do some studies of those materials to really get it locked into your visual vocabulary. Make sure to do these studies from the source and do not copy other artists' studies. And also make sure to use a simplistic lighting setup. For example, 1 light source, 2 max. An easy way to do this is to make a simple sphere with a single light source and a shadow. Using this method means you won't get bogged down with crazy lighting. Plus, you'll also have to learn about bounce lighting. These studies can be done initially in black and white to make it even easier. And once you're comfortable with that material, you can move on to color. If you want an idea of what I mean, do a quick Google search on rendering balls. When doing these studies, make sure to spend more time observing the material and less time trying to make something look pretty. The point of doing these is to accurately reproduce the material and not to make a masterpiece. Render less. Sounds counterintuitive, right? Think about how you observe things in everyday life. Your eyes will naturally focus on certain areas of interest, and everything else is less detailed and sharp. The same thing applies in painting. Don't make the mistake of trying to render everything to the same degree in your painting, as nothing will really stand out, and it will make it much harder for the viewer to understand what the illustration is all about. Once you've chosen what you want the viewer to look at first, or spend more time on, then you can spend more time rendering those areas, and you can spend less time rendering the supporting elements, as they are not as important, and the viewer will be less likely to get hung up on those things that are not the main areas of focus. Having a certain brush will not make you a better artist, nor will having a certain artist's brush enable you to paint exactly like them. At the end of the day, it's going to be your brain interpreting what you want to paint, and your hand creating the final result. With digital painting, it's always tempting to use a fancy texture brush from the get-go. Or if you want everything to look perfectly blended, then you'd be tempted to get out the airbrush. I wouldn't suggest doing either of those things when starting a new painting. Like a lot of artists, I have a ton of brushes. How many of those do I actually use on a regular basis? I'd say about 7. As artists, we naturally want things to look beautiful. And when they don't, our brain literally screams at us to immediately fix something. When an artist goes into full render mode right off the bat, they're usually trying to compensate for a lack of confidence in their abilities, and are simply doing that to make themselves feel better about the painting, rather than doing the all-important groundwork for the painting. This is sometimes referred to as the ugly stage. I actually made an entire video on that very subject, and I'll link it in the description below. Every painting goes through this all-important stage, and I've found that the longer I stay in the ugly stage, the better my paintings generally tend to be. Get used to being uncomfortable. For brushes, I recommend using mostly harder brushes, and using a soft airbrush and textured brushes sparingly. Not only will this be faster in the long run, you'll also be able to incorporate personal brushstrokes, which will add more interest to your work. Plus, if you're using a simple brush, you'll be developing your understanding of what you're painting, rather than relying on a textured brush to do the work for you. Generally, I will use a semi-hard brush to get all of my initial tones in, lights, darks, and mids. Once I have all those down, I can then decide what I want to blend and what I will leave. For certain effects, I will use textured brushes. For example, highlights, I generally use a chalk brush. I will also use a chalk brush for some of my edges to indicate movement. Try to vary your edges, because if they all look the same, the painting will look less realistic as a whole. If I want a really hard edge for something inorganic, per se, I'll use the lasso tool, feather the selection a touch, so it looks a little less digital, and then using a textured brush, I'll paint inside the selection for more interest. Once all your tones are down, which is usually called the blocking in stage, I would suggest spending more time zoomed out than zoomed in. This will help you see everything in context, and you'll be less likely to over-render areas that are not the actual focal points. When you have to zoom in, try not to go any closer than 100%. Sometimes that's unavoidable. The thing is that your viewers will most likely not see all that extra detail that you spend hours on. Not only will this be a more enjoyable painting experience for you, but it will also be much faster, and the painting will have a better flow. As for the actual rendering part, I usually put down 2 tones next to each other, and then using a brush with a slightly reduced opacity, I'll color pick from one color and paint in the other color. In this way, I'll start to get those in-between tones. Depending on the material, I'll either just keep on doing that until I get the desired result, or I'll then finish off the blending by using a soft airbrush to get rid of some of the harder brush marks and to make it look less digital. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more tips on improving your art. Thanks for watching, and keep on painting!